Tonight, though, we are in chapter 13 of Revelation. And as I have mentioned tonight, we start looking at the Antichrist and we start looking at the false prophet as well. And so I want to ask Stacy if you'll go ahead and throw the timeline up there that we've been using throughout this study. And we've talked about the church age and how the rapture in chapter 4 is the calling out of the church. Those that are Christians will be raptured to heaven whenever God says it's time. And that will start 7 years of tribulation. And up until chapter 11, what we have accomplished is we've gotten to the halfway point, basically, of the tribulation. And what we're looking at in chapters 12 and 13 and a couple more chapters is basically, for lack of a better term, a parenthesis in the book of Revelation. Okay, it's a hey, wait a minute, read this. This is something that is happening throughout the entire tribulation time period. So the things that we're talking about tonight, the things that we're reading, are things that are happening throughout the entire tribulation. Even though chronologically on the timeline we're in the middle, some of the things we're talking about tonight occur throughout the entire tribulation. Okay, so Stacy, if you'll go to that next slide, if I remember right. This is in your notes at the top of, I think, the second or third page. I'm not exactly sure. But chapter 13, this is the best explanation for what I was trying to explain to you. Chapter 13 describes the work of the Antichrist during the entire 7 years of the tribulation. And chapter 13 is a parenthetical insertion. Basically, it's a parenthesis coming between the trumpet and the bowl judgments. And we've already been talking about those. Not to indicate that he will begin his reign in the middle of the tribulation, but that his governmental reign will run through the entire period and reach its climax at the middle of the tribulation. And so this that we're talking about tonight spans the entire tribulation, but the Antichrist really sees the epitome of his power occurs in the middle of the tribulation, okay? And so we're going to explain all of this as best we can tonight as we go through. And so, Stacy, if you'll go ahead and take us to the next one. This is the first thing that we'll be looking at is the fact of the Antichrist, okay? And this is, for those of you who've maybe not been with us before on a Sunday night, we're going through this book by Tim LaHaye, and this is Revelation Unveiled. It's a commentary on the book of Revelation, written by the same man who did the Left Behind series. And so that's what we're using for these notes, and it's helping to really explain to us the book of Revelation. The thing that we're going to look at first tonight is what the Bible, not just the book of Revelation and not just chapter 13, we're going to look at what the Bible says about the Antichrist. And so there's a lot of information to give us a fuller picture of who the Antichrist is, the things he's going to do, and then we're going to step into chapter 13 and see what it says specifically about him. And so what you see there is, the first to fill in there is that the Antichrist is nowhere in the Bible used in connection with a specific person. It's used with this idea or this basically the teachings of someone who does things contrary to Christ. And so John in his epistles, he mentions an Antichrist, and he's talking about generically those that oppose the work of God. And that's sort of what he's talking about. But like this says, there is never a specific reference to the Antichrist, to the name. Antichrist is nowhere used in the Bible for a specific person. It's not even used here in the book of Revelation. We see it later that he is given a different title or a different name. Now, the Bible repeatedly predicts that one person will arise and be this embodiment of these anti-Christian or anti-Christ attitudes and purposes and even motives. Okay, and so that's your next fill in there. There is going to be this one person who rises above all else, not only in the world, but in reference to those who have this anti-Christian, this anti-Christ attitude and purposes and motives. And so there's going to be this one person who is the be-all to end-all when it comes to the name of Antichrist or the motives of that person. And so we'll see in chapter 13 that this person comes about during the tribulation. As I've said in recent weeks, when it comes to the Antichrist, you hear all the time, well, this person is the Antichrist, or this person is the Antichrist, or this presidential candidate, or this government leader in another country is the Antichrist. Honestly, if they are, we won't know it until after we're raptured and gone to heaven. So it's really not, you're just taking a stab in the dark because we don't know. And they won't rise to power and really show their cards until years after the rapture. And so if you're a Christian and you're going to be in heaven, not that it's not going to matter to you, but you're not going to know more than likely who it is, and it won't be a bother to you anyway. Now, in the Bible, there are a lot of titles used for this man who will be the Antichrist. And so there's a list of them in your notes, and some of them are fill in the blanks, but I'm going to go through these. And so, Stacy, if you'll go ahead and throw those up there for us. Isaiah 14:4 calls him the king of Babylon. And so that's a good description considering the references to Babylon that we're going to be looking at in the coming weeks. In your notes, you see that he's also called Lucifer. He's called the little horn. He's referred to as a stern-faced king. He's the ruler who will come. In Daniel 11:36, you see there he's referred to as the mighty king. Probably the best description of the Antichrist comes from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where he's referred to as the man of lawlessness, because he's going to come to rise in power when there is a time of lawlessness, but he's also going to cause a lot of problems as well. 2 Thessalonians also refers to him as the man doomed to destruction. Doesn't sound like a leader you would want to follow, does it? A man doomed to destruction is not the leader I want to be following. In 1 John 2:18, he's referred to as the Antichrist. That is a title used and for those with that prerogative. But also in Revelation 13:1, we see that he's referred to as a beast coming out of the sea. And that's the one we're going to be looking at tonight. Excuse me. But of all those titles, though, the man of lawlessness is obviously the best one, because he is going to come on the scene when there is a lot of lawlessness in the world. Now, in your notes, we're not going to go through these, but there is a contrast between Christ and the Antichrist from this book by Dr. Clarence Larkin. It's called Dispensational Truth. And there in your book, there in your notes, there is a 14 contrast, or comparisons if you want to look at it that way, but they're contrast between Christ and the Antichrist and what the scriptures tell us about him. Like, number 10 says Christ is the truth and Antichrist is the lie, if you want to look at it that way. And so there's, basically the Antichrist will be an opposite an opposite reflection, if you want to look at it that way, of Christ. Everything that Christ is, he's going to be the exact opposite. And that goes back to the thing we talked about last week, how Satan is a copycat. Satan is not an originator. Satan takes things and perverts them and changes them. He copies the things that God has created, the things that God has done. And so Antichrist, he's not going to be original with it. He's just basically going to look at Christ and say, oh, Christ is this, Christ is that. Well, I'm just going to be the opposite of it. And so that's basically what we see there. Now, one of the things that is oftentimes asked is, who is the Antichrist going to be? Which we said, we don't know who specifically he will be. But one of the things that sometimes is a question is, well, where will he arise from? Will he come from the U.S.? Will he come from somewhere in Europe or Asia? Where will he come from? And so the next fill-in that you have talks about his nationality. And the first thing is we see, and this will paint a picture for us. And so the first thing is that, Revelation 13:1 says, that John saw a beast coming out of the sea. Now, as you see there in your notes, the sea peoples around the Mediterranean are the ones that John is probably speaking of, which means that he will be a Gentile. Okay? And so the Antichrist will be someone who is a Gentile. And so not only that, but Daniel chapter 8 tells us that he is the small horn, which is a reference to Daniel's vision of having to do primarily with Alexander the Great and the Greeks. And so that refers to the smallest of the four Grecian horns that is referenced in Daniel chapter 8, meaning that he will be part Greek. So he's going to be a Gentile, and he's going to have some Greek heritage, because he, the Mediterranean, that's where Greece is at. And so not only will he be a Gentile, he'll have a Greek heritage. But then in Daniel chapter 9, it says that he is the ruler of the people that will come. And if you know anything about what Daniel is talking about there, he's talking about the nation that would come and take over Israel and would eventually be the ones that would sacrifice the Messiah. And so what that means is that this particular Antichrist, he will be of the royal lineage of the race that destroyed Jerusalem. And we know from world history that means he will be predominantly Roman. And so he will have a predominantly Roman heritage. Does that mean he's going to come from Italy? No, it doesn't. Does it mean that he's going to come from somewhere in Europe? Possibly. We don't know. That's all speculation. But we know that he's going to be a Gentile, that he will have a Greek heritage, but he will also have a predominantly Roman heritage. And then Daniel chapter 11 also tells us that he will have no regard for the God of his fathers. Now, the suggestion that the author of the book gives is that means that he will be a Jew who does not reveal his ancestry. And so we see that even in the time of Hitler. Hitler had a Jewish background to some degree, and there was some family lineage there that was a Jewish tie, and that was something that he kept under wraps. He didn't share that, but we know that from world history. And this Antichrist will do much the same thing. It will be a part of his lineage, but it's not something he's going to exactly advertise. And so what we see is that he's going to be a Roman Grecian Jew who is really symbolic of all people. And so he's going to be sort of this composite of all people. He's going to be he's going to be sort of an everyman type of person. And what that means, we don't know. We don't know who he will be. Now, what we do know from books of the Bible outside of the book of Revelation, we do know quite a bit about his future activities, what he's going to be doing during that 7 years of the tribulation. And the first thing that we're going to look at, we're going to talk about 7 of these things. But the first one is, it's his rise to power. He's going to come onto the stage after the chaos, or during the chaos of the rapture. He's going to come onto the stage and he's going to help bring peace to the world. He's going to help get everything sort of calmed down and get everybody back to the way things were. And what we see here is that the Antichrist will assume that power that he has by diplomacy. He's not going to come in waving a big sword and saying, I'm going to take over and I'm going to do all these things. He's going to come in and he's going no offense, he's going to be a politician. He's going to come in there, he's going to try and do diplomacy, and he's going to try and make things all smooth and take care of things, and he's going to gain this power through those ways. Now, Daniel chapter 8, verse 25 tells us this. It says, he will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. And so we see that he's going to, even from when we understand the rider on the white horse as a reference to the Antichrist, we realize he's going to gain his power through diplomacy. Now, we also know that in this time during the tribulation, following the rapture, he's going to do all he can to put the entire world under one government. And so he will have this one world government. And Daniel chapter 2 tells us a little bit about what will happen here, because Revelation 17 tells us that the kings of the earth will give him their power. Okay, so they're going to willingly, to some degree, on some level, some of them are going to give their power to the Antichrist. They're basically going to sign over their rights to their kingdom, so to speak. And the Antichrist is going to take on larger and larger kingdoms until he has basically taken over the entire world. Now, he's going to do this under the guise or under the deception of, hey, I can fix all the world's problems. And that's how he's going to accomplish some of this. Now, as you see there in the notes, Daniel chapter 2 predicts that there will be this image that will be a part of his one world government. It will be a part of the worship of him. And what Daniel chapter 2 does is it predicts that this, in the image of Nebuchadnezzar, where there are the 10 toes that are used in the image, they represent a combination of those 10 kings under one person, and that is the dominance of the Antichrist. And so we see that this reference to Nebuchadnezzar's statue is going to play out when those 10 kings give their dominance or their power over to the Antichrist. But see, when they give him their power for their countries or for their kingdoms, what we're going to see is that he will also dominate their economies. Okay, and so he's going to dominate the world economy at this time too, because those kings cannot sign over the rights to their kingdoms without giving him everything. That's military, that's land, that's resources, and that's economy as well. And so, as you see there, he's going to give over his armies, but he's also going to be giving over their economic power to the Antichrist as well. And so we see how he is starting to develop this power and all of this control that he has over the world at this time. Now, we also know that during this time, he's going to push a religious agenda as well. And so the Antichrist is going to have this atheistic religion that is going to be pushed onto the world at this time. Now, in Revelation chapter 17, we'll be there in just a few weeks, the Antichrist will give approval, as it says there, to an all-inclusive world church. And I use the term church very loosely. Okay, that really should probably say religious organization. But it's going to merge all of the religions in the world. And so basically what they're going to say is that, in some way, during the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, what will happen is the Antichrist will work with the false prophet that we're going to learn about tonight as well. He's going to allow his religious leader, the false prophet, is going to work to merge all of these religions in the world together under one banner, under one church or one religious organization. And so basically that means that you could very well come into a building just like this, and you could have Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists and Christians and this and that and the other worshiping in one place, all because of the way the Antichrist has pulled all of these world religions together in this time of chaos. Now here is the catch. For the first 3.5 years, this religious superpower, if you want to look at it that way, is going to be under the impression that it is calling the shots, and the Antichrist is their puppet. What they find out is halfway through the tribulation, at the midway point, the Antichrist basically throws off the religious part of it and then enforces this worship of himself as a god for the last 3.5 years. And so there will be references to this in some of the stuff that we read in the coming weeks about some of the things that we read about. So understand that during that first 3.5 years, the religious church of this multi-religious group is going to think that they are calling the shots, and then halfway through, when the Antichrist at the midway point breaks his covenant with the nation of Israel and basically throws off the restraints of this religious superpower. He's going to take over, and his false prophet is basically going to get people to worship Satan and the Antichrist during this time for the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. And so I'm hoping that that helps to explain some of what we'll look at a little later. Now, number 5 in your notes there is that he's going to have a covenant with Israel. And so right after the rapture, sometime probably in the first couple of months, maybe even in the first year after the rapture, in the tribulation time, the Antichrist is going to have a covenant with the nation of Israel. It's going to work some sort of peace in the Middle East to where the Arabs allow the nation of Israel to rebuild the temple. They're going to start their worship of God again in the temple. And basically, as it says there, the covenant will only serve to keep the children of Israel from truly seeking God, because they're going to be worshiping Him as if they were still in the Old Testament rather than pursuing the Messiah. And so what we see here is that this covenant will only serve for them to seek God. And I didn't get the word God underlined in that one. I'm sorry on your notes, but that is the answer there. But halfway through the tribulation period, at the midway point, what we'll see is that the Antichrist is going to break this covenant with Israel, and that will really open their eyes up to who he was and what he was doing. The other thing we know about him is his death and resurrection. And I use the term resurrection very loosely, because we know resurrection from the resurrection of Christ, and what will occur with the Antichrist is something completely false and deceptive on the part of Satan. And so Revelation chapter 17 talks about how he will die and then be brought back to life. There's some references about the Antichrist dying and then being brought back to life. And the Antichrist will die in the middle of the tribulation. Something will happen. There's some speculation by the author that one of the kings or some of the kings that are not happy about the way the Antichrist has taken over the world or whatever, they will attempt to assassinate the Antichrist, because they don't want to they may be the final holdouts, they may be the final rebellious group, but what will happen is there will be a time when he is killed. We assume that it's something like that. But what will happen is, after he dies, Satan will indwell him to duplicate the resurrection. Now, notice I said that, to duplicate it. It's not truly a duplication of the resurrection, because the resurrection of Christ is the fact that Christ was dead and he was brought back to life by the power of God. This is a manipulation by Satan to mimic the resurrection, because Christ was not indwelt, his body was not indwelt by anyone else. He was brought back to life by the power of God. The Antichrist is going to be dead. He's going to be dead as a doornail, as we would say. He's going to be dead. And then Satan is going to indwell him. Or, the term that we would generally think of is possess. And so during that time, Satan's going to be able to use the Antichrist to draw more worship to himself and more worship to the Antichrist during that time. Now, the final thing that we know about him is his ultimate destruction as far as the Antichrist goes. And so we see that Christ in Revelation chapter 19, this is one of the most powerful scenes you'll ever read about in the entire Bible, is when Christ destroys Satan. And in Revelation 19 we read about that. He's going to destroy Satan. He's going to destroy the Antichrist, the false prophet, their followers, the armies that are following them. And all of that's going to happen. Now, only, as it says there in your notes, only the Antichrist and the false prophet will not be judged. Basically, because of how bad they've been, they don't even get judgment, so to speak. They are considered, I guess, if you want to look at it in this regard, they are considered on par with Satan. And so, as far as the vile evilness of their ways. And so there's no reference in the scriptures of them being judged. They're basically thrown into the lake of fire. And so I guess that in and of itself is judgment. by God, because he has to decide whether you're going to heaven or into the lake of fire, and so God obviously decided or judged them, but it's not recorded in Scripture how that will happen. Now here's where we get started with tonight's text in Revelation chapter 13, okay? And so here's how we're going to do this. We're going to read Revelation 13 verses 1 through 10, and we're going to try and work through this and discover more about what Revelation 13 says about the Antichrist. And if we can get to the false prophet in the second half of chapter 13, we will, but if not, we'll get there next week. And so follow along with me as we read Revelation 13 verses 1 through 10, and then we're going to come back and break them down. And so it says this: "And the dragon, which is Satan, stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea." Now let me go ahead and tell you as we read this, this is the Antichrist that he's referring to. Okay, so you can sort of follow along and understand what he's saying. "I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast," Satan gave the Antichrist, "his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was astonished and followed the beast." That's a reference to the false resurrection, okay, just so you know. "Men worshipped the dragon," or Satan, "because he had given authority to the beast," Antichrist, "and they also worshipped the beast," Antichrist, "and asked, 'Who is like the beast? Who can make war against him?' The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise his authority for 42 months. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. He was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain beyond." Okay, let me make sure I read that. "All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. All those names who have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. He who has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints." And so right here we get a whole lot of information overload when it comes to the Antichrist. But what we understand is that as we go through and figure out exactly what is being said here, it makes a whole lot more sense for us, okay? And so what we see is that there is a description of this beast, and this beast is described as having, let's see what it says, resembled a leopard but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. Now there is no, and had 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 crowns on those horns. Now we know that there is no creature in creation that looks like that. We know that there is no animal that actually looks like that. So again, common sense or biblical sense tells us that if there is not something in creation that looks like that, then it has to be symbolic of something. And one of the things that we know is that from studies of the scriptures that God uses, or the writers of the Bible used beast as terms for rulers and even governments, okay? And so as your notes say there, talking about the description of the beast, there is some controversy or discussions over the identity of this beast. And some believe it's a religious organization, okay? Some believe that it is a religious organization of some sort. Others believe that it is a kingdom and not a king, okay? And so both of those first two sort of line up together, that they talk a lot about the same thing, that this beast is some sort of institution, some sort of group, and it's not a specific person. That's what those first two ideas are about who the beast is. And those are valid, but they don't make a whole lot of sense with some of the things that we read later. Others believe that it is a reference to a king and his kingdom. It goes back to the references that we read a lot of times when we read in the scriptures, and it's sort of like the floodlight versus a spotlight perspective. Sometimes when we read in the scriptures, it talks about Babylon. Let's just use that as an example, especially in the book of Daniel. There's the talk of Babylon. Well, sometimes if it is a floodlight scenario, it's talking about the nation or the kingdom of Babylon. But if it is a spotlight perspective, it may be talking about King Nebuchadnezzar. It's focused in on the king rather than the kingdom. And so there is some belief that, this reference of a beast is not only to a king, but also his kingdom as well. And that's more in line with what we're talking about here, is that this is talking about the Antichrist and his rule over the world. And so what we notice, though, is that when we read about this description, we read that it begins talking about these 7 heads on this beast. And they're probably one, as it says in your notes, it's probably one of the more difficult things to describe and to explain. But the 7 heads are mentioned also in Revelation chapter 17. And they're described as the kings of the Roman Empire. Okay? And so the best definition given is that they are the 6 Roman kings that led up to John's day back, in the year 95 AD. And that the 7th head is the Antichrist. Because that makes the most sense when we look at the way this would unfold. There were 6 kings up until the time of John. And then the 7th king is obviously the Antichrist. And the 10 horns that are mentioned here in Revelation 13, they basically correspond to the vision that Daniel has in Daniel chapter 2, or the vision in Daniel chapter 2 that King Nebuchadnezzar had. And those 10 horns describe the beast that represent the Roman Empire in Daniel chapter 7. But what we get from this is that these 10 horns are all horns in the Bible, as we've mentioned in the past, are a sign of power and authority and things like that. These 10 horns are the 10 kings who give their power to the Antichrist. We've already talked about that. These kings are going to give him their power, their economies, their land, their resources. And so these 10 horns on this beast are going to be representative of those 10 kings who during the tribulation period say, "Here, take my land. Here, take my people. Here, take my resources." And so that's sort of an understanding of how that will play out. Now, here is the catch. We talked about in the scriptures there in verses 3 and 4, where it talks a little bit about how one of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. That sounds a lot like a resurrection story. And then it says the whole world was astonished and followed the beast. And so people will see the Antichrist be killed and then be resurrected, and then they're going to want to follow him all the more. And part of the reason for that is the fact that the Christian example of the resurrection will not immediately be erased from the minds of people just because the church is raptured. There will still be references to the resurrection. There will still be references to those things. And so people will know about those sort of things. And when they see a glimpse of that in the death and resurrection of the Antichrist, then it's going to make them, "Oh, I remember that from years ago. Oh, that must be a God thing. Oh, I'm going to worship him. Because he's got to be like Christ if this is, he's been resurrected the same way." And so that sort of thing will play into it. Now, verse 3 indicates that the Antichrist will be killed during the tribulation. Okay, that's what it's telling. That he seemed to have a fatal wound, but then he was healed. So it's a reference to a resurrection example there, or a resurrection story, as we've said. Now, Revelation 17:8 tells us that what will happen to him is he will be placed in the pit, in the abyss. He will basically be put where he belongs, but then he's going to be resurrected. Okay? According to, as we've already said, it's not going to be a true resurrection where God uses his power to bring the person back to life, but instead this is going to be an indwelling of the Antichrist by Satan. Okay? And so he will appear to have been resurrected. And so after this, it will give him just a greater opportunity to deceive people. People are going to, as I said, they're going to follow him because there's going to be that collective consciousness, that collective remembrance of the Christ resurrection. And when they see this, they're going to be like, oh, that's like that Bible story. Oh, I remember hearing about that as a kid in church, or I remember hearing about that. And oh, yeah, I'm going to follow him because it must be the same thing. Well, what we see is, though, that as he gains power, he becomes more brazen and bold towards God. And what we see is that he starts having blasphemies or saying blasphemies towards God. Now, in the middle of the tribulation, when he is fatally wounded, Satan will be kicked out of heaven. We talked about that. I believe that was last week. We talked about him being kicked out of heaven. And so he's going to be free to take on the Antichrist body and simulate the resurrection. Okay? So Satan is going to have been kicked out of heaven at this point, as we read about last week. And that will make him free to indwell the Antichrist and do a lot to deceive and really lead people astray. Now, as what we read about in the scriptures, Satan will actually enter the body of the Antichrist to bring him back to life. He's going to indwell him. What it will do is, as it says there in your notes, it's going to deceive many people into thinking that he has God-like powers. As I said, it's going to be that remembrance of the Christian resurrection. And then we're like, oh yeah, I remember hearing about that. It's got to be that same thing. Because it happened once before, thousands of years ago. It has to be the same thing. And it's going to deceive people into worshiping the Antichrist. But during all of this time, even though he's going to seem to have these godlike powers, there is going to be real world power that he will have during this time. Verse 7 tells us basically that this one world government that's being ran by the Antichrist will give him power and control over every tribe, people, language, and nation. That doesn't say most of. That says every. Think about that. There will not be a tribe, people, language, nation on the earth that is not under his control. Now think about that. There are jungles in Africa, there are jungles in Indonesia and places all over the world where you're going to have a hard time gaining control over those people. But now we read that there will be a time where they will be subjected to the Antichrist like so many other nations. So many other people. The good thing is that back in Revelation chapter 7, it told us about the 144,000 witnesses who are going to be sharing the gospel. And so it's not all doom and gloom. There will be those that will be leading people to salvation. But the last couple of verses here tell us about the worship of the Antichrist during this time. One of the things is human beings a lot of times seek to worship those things that they can see. This is, it's really shown in the fact that there are still people today who worship idols. There are people who worship different relics and things like that. And that's where their worship goes because man is incurably religious, as it's been said. We have friends that are missionaries in Asia. And they've talked with us before, and they talked about going into this home in a remote place in the country that they serve in, and I can't unfortunately share that. But in that country, they went into this home, and there on the mantle, or what we would call a mantle, were family idols. They were still worshiping idols, just like you read about in the Old Testament. It's kind of interesting. The lady in the family, a friend of ours, she talked about going into a store to buy a piece of furniture and found this beautiful looking mantle. She said, "Oh, it would just look beautiful around a set of gas logs or whatever in the States," and said went to go look at it. Started to find out, said it was a family altar. Is what it was. It was an altar that they would take in their house and put their idols across, and that's in 2016, 17, 18 time frame. There's still people around the world that are worshiping idols, and the thing about it is they look for an idol to worship, and a lot of times when they don't know the living God. But during the tribulation period, what we see is that Satan will provide for them that visible God. He's going to provide for them someone with seemingly divine powers. And to them, they're going to see him and they're going to think, wow, this has to be a God. Well, it's Satan manipulating the situation, but nevertheless, they're going to see him and think, man, he has to be a God. And so they're going to want to worship him. And because the Antichrist / Satan, however you want to look at it, will be right there in front of them doing these things, they're going to think, oh, we'll worship him. Oh, we'll be able to worship him. And as we'll see next week, because we're not going to get to the false prophet tonight, next week we'll see that the false prophet even sets up a statue, an idol, an image, and in some way, we don't know how it works, some way it has the ability to talk. And during that time, people will worship this statue and this image of the Antichrist, and they're going to. It's going to be a very dark time spiritually. Now, I'm going to close out with this. There's a reference here to the Book of Life in here. It says, and that's the part I read and had to reread to make sure I'd read it right. But it says, all the inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. That means everybody on earth will worship the Antichrist, okay? But it says, all whose names have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. And so basically what that is a reference to is the Lamb's book of life. And we know the Lamb is Christ. And so the book, if you haven't read in the book this chapter, there's a really good explanation of two of the books in heaven that are referenced here. And one is the book of life, which is, the way he explains it is that every person who's ever been born, their name is written into the book of life. Now, if they die and do not receive Christ, their name is blotted out or erased, as we would look at it, blotted out of the book of life. But if they have become a Christian, then what we see is that their name remains in the book of life, but it is also recorded. It's only recorded in the Lamb's book of life when we give our life to Christ. When we start a relationship with Christ, our name is written in the Lamb's book of life, and it can't be erased. It can't be blotted out of that book. And so that is a piece of information that we find here, and we'll talk about it a little bit later when we talk about books being opened in heaven, and that's what we'll be talking about there.